Let us pray. Loving God, speak to us this morning as we study your word. Open our eyes, open our ears that we may hear your voice and your wisdom. May our words and our meditations this morning honor and glorify you. Amen. I am a pastor. It's a calling that I love. But I've also had other roles throughout my life, such as my very first work experience in making pizza. And not just any pizza, but Costco pizza. It was an important role. I was able to feed people. And I've also, throughout my life, been able to protect people as a mall security guard. Now, granted, it was next to a ginormous retirement community called Leisure World in Laguna Hills, and there was one woman in her 90s who would lap me as she walked around the mall, but I was there just in case. Both of these experiences and other experiences throughout my life, you get to do a lot of people watching. Now, I know that sounds a little bit creepy, but it can actually be kind of a wonderful thing to see a wide array of people and families in different situations. When they're hungry, stopping for a bite to eat and sharing a delicious, albeit somewhat greasy pizza meal, or when shopping or walking around an air-conditioned mall. When I was in seminary, I would sometimes take my books and my readings and my laptop, and I would go over to Disneyland, and I would head to California Adventures to get some of my work done on the beautiful pier that they have there. And I would be able to see all of the different families around me, all of the different family dynamics. And in my major, I was focusing on pastoral care and counseling. And when you have spent tons of money on a day at the amusement park and your children are in the process of melting down and you are rushing to that next show and trying to get there on time and you are arguing with your spouse, let's just say I learned a lot. And yes, there was plenty of evidence for conflict within families there, but there were also these beautiful snapshots of reconciliation, of forgiveness, of living in the moment with your family. There is a UK-based reconciliation charity called the Forgiveness Project. And it's a wonderful website that contains all of these different stories of forgiveness. They believe that stories have the power to transform, that in sharing stories of forgiveness, they might help to build hope and empathy and understanding. For when you see it modeled in others, you have a bit of a roadmap. You have a little bit of a GPS to help you and to help me as we navigate the complicated waters of forgiveness and reconciliation. And many of these stories on this website are feel-good stories, that they have happy endings where forgiveness has happened and healing is possible. Happy endings. We all like happy endings, don't we? And a spoiler alert, Joseph, whose story we are looking at today, also has a bit of a happy ending. But when talking about forgiveness, it can be hard sometimes to hear of these stories with these clear and tidy resolutions. Because we have all experienced moments of being hurt and betrayed and disappointed during our lives. And there are times when we have been able to forgive, and there are times where we haven't. And maybe it's because we haven't gotten there yet, but also there are times when we've gone through situations where we can't even consider forgiving yet. It doesn't even enter our frame of mind. And while we can't ever expect someone else to forgive, we can't ever put ourselves into somebody else's shoes, this morning we have an invitation to take a look at our own lives, to see how we have engaged with the important call of Jesus. When Peter asked Jesus, how many times should I forgive? He asks him this in Matthew 18:21. And he asked Jesus, how many times? As many as 7 times? And Jesus says to him, not 7 times, I tell you, 77 times, or 70 times 7. And so today we are looking at the ending of Joseph's story, and we can find in it wisdom for us as we wrestle with questions about our acts of human forgiveness, but also of God's forgiveness towards us. And so we left off last week with Joseph, who has been sold by his brothers, as sold into slavery and being brought down to Egypt by the Ishmaelite caravan. And over the next 8 chapters, many things happen. We hear about the brothers bringing back Joseph's robe to their father. They've dipped it in goat blood to prove that Joseph has died. And we see Jacob just fall to pieces in grief over the loss of his favorite son. Joseph is taken to Egypt, and he is sold to Potiphar, who is an officer of Pharaoh. We learn that the Lord continues to be with Joseph, that he becomes a successful man, and eventually he is even put in charge of his master's house. However, in the meantime, Potiphar's wife has noticed that Joseph is a handsome and good-looking man. And Joseph turns down her many, many invitations, and there's even one passage of how she grabs a hold of his garment, and he escapes and flees from her naked. She then takes that garment to show to her husband, and she says that this Israelite, this Hebrew man, has insulted me. And so Potiphar imprisons Joseph, along with other prisoners of the Pharaoh. Long story short, Joseph not only is now a dreamer, but he becomes a dream interpreter of the other prisoners. And one of them, a chief cupbearer of the Pharaoh, is down the road restored to Pharaoh's good graces. And when the Pharaoh starts to have some crazy dreams, he reminds him of Joseph sitting in the prison and encourages the Pharaoh to bring this young man to interpret his dreams. Joseph predicts a time of plenty. He interprets the Pharaoh's dreams as describing that there will be abundance in the land for a period of time, and then it will be followed by a time of severe famine. And the Pharaoh is so impressed, he makes Joseph in charge over all the land, second only to himself. Years later, the famine does in fact happen, and people from all over come to Egypt for some of the food that they have stored over the years of plenty. And some of the people who come are Joseph's brothers. Joseph gives them food so the family doesn't starve, but the brothers do not recognize him. And so he tests them a little bit to see if they've grown, to see if they've changed, to see if they've learned things over the years. He accuses the youngest Benjamin of theft, and he decrees that the family may leave, but that Benjamin must stay as a slave. Now Judah, the oldest, he begs for mercy, and he says he offers himself to stay in Benjamin's place. He cries that the suffering of their father would be insurmountable, incalculable, if he were to lose his youngest son. And so Joseph knows that things have changed, that his brothers are not the same as they were before. But it's not just the brothers who have changed. They are not the only ones who are different. Alan Johnson, in his Feasting on the Word commentary, points out that what has happened to Joseph over all of these years is today what we would call psychological growth. Joseph was an arrogant young man. His self-importance angered his brothers so much that they sold him into slavery. But from this pit of despair, Joseph did rise with wisdom. Revenge had been replaced with compassion. And now growth is offered to his brothers as well. They have all been humbled by the trials and tribulations of life that have brought them closer to their true, whole selves. And I love that thought, being humbled by the trials and tribulations of life that bring us closer to our true whole selves. No one wants to go through the hardships of life. But isn't it true that through them, through the hard times, we see how dependent we are on one another. We see how reliant we are on our faith and on the strength and peace that God offers us. Yes, it is simpler to be our best selves when times are easy and good. But it's through the trials that we find out who we truly are. As we read and as we heard this morning that Joseph, he sees his brothers. He sees them being humble. He sees them willing to sacrifice themselves for their youngest brother. And he breaks into tears. In fact, we're told that he wept so loudly that even the Egyptians and the household of the Pharaoh heard him. And Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. He tells them who he is, and he asks after their father. Then he invites them to come closer, and he says, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, because God has sent me before you to preserve life. Joseph quickly extends grace, and he moves towards reconciliation with his understanding that God's divine purposes have been at work throughout his journey. Alan Johnson invites us to pause for a moment here and to recognize that stopping for a moment is important when we declare the ways that God is working and God's purposes in the world. In other words, we should use discernment. We should use wisdom when we say that something is a part of God's plan. We hear that a lot, right? That things are part of God's plan. Well, Johnson points out that to name God's ways as our ways leads to arrogance, but not to name the presence of God in our human affairs leads to an emaciated faith. Here, Joseph is looking back over his life. He is discerning that even through the challenging, even through the hard, even through the heartbreaking times, God has woven things together for good. And this ties to the deep questions that we have, doesn't it? How God and evil can share the same space. This is a question of theodicy. And through this story, we witness the idea that through the beautiful and the ugly, the easy and the difficult, the good and the evil in the world, God can move and work through all of that, in the midst of all of that, to bring about good. The pattern of divine love woven into life, bringing good out of evil. Now, I have always been fascinated with Catholic saints and with mystics. The stories of their faith and their dedication to God I find so incredibly powerful and interesting. And Julian of Norwich, an English mystic who lived in the late 14th, the early 15th centuries. She was a Benedictine nun, and she lived through a period of time where the Black Death was present. The most severe and devastating pandemic in human history that killed over 75 million people. And we can kind of relate a little tiny bit with Julian right now during this pandemic that we are experiencing. But she had these incredible visions and experiences with God, and she herself was mortally ill. But she decided that she would write down and she would record these visions that she had. And eventually she actually wrote the first book by a woman in English. And she wrote this: "And so our good Lord answered to all the questions and doubts which I could raise, saying most comfortingly, I may make all things well, and I can make all things well. And I shall make all things well, and I will make all things well, and you will see yourself that every kind of thing will be well." Now, this isn't just a cheery optimism or a superficial faith, but here is this affirmation of the mystery of God's love in all things, in all circumstances, even in the midst of personal and enormous human tragedies. So Joseph, he was creating that same space for and with his brothers, a safe space for the hard work of reconciliation to be done, an acknowledgement of the past, but a willingness to let go and share a new perspective from God with his family. And so Joseph, he builds a bridge. We hear this morning how he identified himself twice before his brothers. He wept twice in their presence, and he recalls their common story. And while at first the brothers are dumbfounded, they don't have any words, through Joseph's vulnerability, they understand that their bratty, spoiled younger brother has also changed. We are told that Joseph kissed all his brothers and wept upon them, and after that his brothers talked with him. Caesarius, the renowned bishop of Aros, who lived around the year 500 CE, he notes that as Joseph moistened the necks of his frightened brothers with his refreshing tears, he washed away their hatred. And so, a happy ending. The family came to be in Egypt to avoid the hardship of the famine in the land, and they were reconciled as a family, a happy ending. If only it were the same for us all of the time. But what about those times when we have wanted restoration but haven't found it? When the hurts and the pains in our stories haven't led to forgiveness, but instead have led to resentment. We should also remember that focusing or pushing or guilting someone else to forgive can be damaging. For women throughout the centuries who have been told that they must forgive their spouses even in the midst of domestic abuse. For communities of color who have struggled against racism and oppression and the death of their loved ones. Forgiveness can be complicated. What is the role of forgiveness in the face of horrific circumstances like the Holocaust? There is an amazing book called The Sunflower. It's a short story and a collection of essays from theologians and philosophers and great thinkers. And it's all about the question of forgiveness. The short story is when a young German man asks a Jewish man for forgiveness after having killed many people. And the question is, what is the role of forgiveness? Can you even forgive on behalf of others? And what is the relationship between forgiveness and justice? Forgiveness isn't easy. There are a lot of questions to process through. And there is a recognition of the huge difference that there is between expecting someone else to forgive and wrestling with our own places where forgiveness is needed. Our forgiveness towards others or the forgiveness of others towards us in times where we have fallen short. Now, it has been said that while all of the world's major religions teach about the necessity of forgiveness, it's only been recently that the medical and the scientific community and world has delved into the importance of forgiveness for health and well-being. And now it is more widely known that unforgiveness or the holding on to past hurts and resentments, that can deeply affect our emotional and even our physical health. The Presbyterian minister, writer, and retreat leader Marjorie Thompson writes this: "To forgive is to make a conscious choice to release the person who has wounded us from the sentence of our judgment, however justified that judgment may be. It represents a choice to leave behind our resentment and our desire for retribution, however fair such punishment may seem. Forgiveness involves excusing persons from the punitive consequences they deserve because of their behavior. The behavior remains condemned, but the offender is released from its effects as far as the forgiver is concerned. Forgiveness means the power of the original wound's power to hold us trapped is broken. Maybe Joseph's story is a little bit more complex than just a happy ending. Alan Hilton points out that Joseph's story holds space for us because however different our reality is from Joseph's, God's reconciling movement in the world still and always hinges on forgiveness. Everyone has access because the dramatic moment of Genesis 45 longs to be played out again and again anytime someone is wronged. A pope steps into an Italian jail cell and forgives his would-be assassin. A grieving mother walks across a tense courtroom to embrace the man whose drunk driving snatched away her son's life. In South Africa, race inconceivably forgives race. Joseph's God lives on in a new form. A wife forgives her husband, a friend forgives a friend, an enemy forgives enemy. Reconciliation breaks out in those moments, and suddenly the position of the victim is radically changed. In the moment of forgiveness, the wronged one is transformed from a critic of the world as it is to a co-creator with God of a brand new world. And in that creation, a light comes on that maybe our world is not so different from Joseph's after all. Maybe forgiveness and reconciliation are God's true prosperity. May it be so for us and for the world. Amen.